how should we be thinking about the cost of education in India? Usually when people talk about cost of service, they tend to put together what the different elements of what adds up to the total cost of a service and identify that as the cost of a service. So in the specific context of education, if you want to know what does it cost to educate a child, you would take all the different aspects of the government's budget for education, and to put a complicated exercise somewhat simply, you sort of divvy that up with the total number of enrollments to get your per child cost. And government will say, as the government of India does, that the median per child cost of a student going to government schools in India, based on this is I'm now using some figures that we calculated, which are slightly dated, but from the point of view of making the point useful, is rupees 14,615. This is this as at one level the cost of what it costs taxpayers of India, what it would cost taxpayers of India to educate its students, 14,615 rupees per student. Now, we could make our government budgets using that number, but we also do know that private school expenditure is significantly lower. We know that anecdotally, and you put all the numbers together and you realize that that anecdotal story is in fact not untrue. It often surprises people, perhaps a lot of you, because you have the access to the internet and you're listening to me speak to you. You've probably gone to a somewhat more expensive school, but the average cost of a government school is significantly lower, of a private school, sorry, is significantly lower. And by an estimate that we made in 2011-12, we discovered that the private school per child cost is rupees 5,961, 14,615 versus 5,961. So a typical Indian state educating a student in government school costs more than twice as much. So which is the right cost? It's also quite common when you think about how education debates have evolved to argue that India doesn't spend enough on education. Now, no doubt that's true, but you do have to ask yourselves, if we need to spend more, what should that be? After all, budgets are made in the context of scarce resources. No one has everything. And we also know Karthick Murlidharan's work in Indonesia, for example, tells us this. Some work in India also reaffirms this. And in fact, if you just look at the average cost of a government school teacher's salary, the data and map it to the data on learning outcomes, the answer is quite stark, that paying teachers more doesn't necessarily mean that you will get a high quality education. So how does one conceptually think about this, and how does one conceptually then try to develop a effective, cost-effective story of what it would cost to give students in India an education? We've drawn on two concepts of costing to understand this a little bit: the accounting cost and the economic cost. The accounting cost is a budgetary cost of a student year of publicly provided schooling, which is essentially, as I mentioned, the total arrived at from adding different aspects of government expenditure and divvying it up. In a sense, this is a descriptive cost. This is what it costs government. This is what government is spending. You divvy it up by the enrollment. This is what the per student cost would be. Is that the real cost? That's when the concept of economic cost is a useful conceptual category within which we can start asking ourselves this question. Economists define the economic cost is a conceptual category, not a descriptive category. It is a category that it sort of looks at what the minimum cost of providing a service of a certain quality standard would be, and looking at how agents behave in that context, on the basis of which it determines what the cost is. The economic cost is essentially calculating cost on the basis of the lowest it would cost to provide a service of a certain standard. And that's the difference between accounting and economic cost. Accounting cost looks at what you are, it's a sort of descriptive account of what you are spending. The economic cost is a conceptual category that is looking at what would it take to arrive at a certain quality of, what it would take to, of what it would cost to arrive at a certain quality of spending at the minimum possible. That's a very important distinction to make. So in essence, if the costing is determined at the appropriate level at which costing should be, traditionally, expectedly, the accounting cost and the economic cost should be more or less similar. In education in India, you find that the accounting cost, the government's cost, which is 14,615, is significantly higher than the economic cost, which is 5,961. And here's where it gets even more complicated, which is that on average, and of course there are a whole host of other reasons why this is the case, but private school education is some learning outcomes are, if you take ASAR data for instance, are marginally better than government school learning outcomes. So if you want to be provocative, impute the cost of an education or impute the cost of learning, you could argue that the cost of learning is 5,961 and the government cost of schooling is 14,615. Now, it's important to be careful in this interpretation and analysis, because the point here is not to say that we should be spending less on education. It is to say that we should be spending efficiently on education. If 14,615 rupees can get me a high quality education, then as a taxpayer, I will happily and willingly contribute to that. But if at 14,615, I am getting 25% absenteeism, and I am getting 50% students reaching standard 5 but barely being able to read a standard 2 text, there is a question mark there. If I am getting somewhat better yet god awful education at a far lower cost, which is 5,961, that mapping then becomes a complicated context, and it actually breaks the accountability cycle of taxation, quality public services and accountability in democracies. So it is these are two very important conceptual categories that are worth considering when one tries to figure out what the appropriate cost of service ought to be like, and whether at a high cost of service one is actually getting high value as a consequence. And I think one thing that we know about education in India is the high cost of service is not giving us high value for money. And one of the reasons why that is teacher salaries, because as our calculations tell us, the bulk of the education budget goes to teacher salaries, and teacher salaries are enormously high. Now, should we be paying teachers less? Well, if the market is paying teachers that are giving more or less the same quality of education far less, there's a case to be made. Should a government signal its priority by giving more money into education? Absolutely. But when it makes its determination to give more money in education, it also needs to make that determination of exactly where and how it wants to spend that money in a manner that ensures that it will provide high quality, accountable services. So the argument on service delivery and the argument on costs of government service delivery is not as clear and straightforward as one would ideally think it should be. There's no question India spends far less on public services like education, and the story in health is even worse than it should, and certainly not at comparable levels to other countries in the world. But are we spending what we have efficiently and effectively? The answer is no. And I think that it will be much easier to make a good faith argument that we need to invest more if one can at the same time create a context where efficiency gains are seen as important as money that is put into a problem.